I guess we might as well get started. There's a few other people who will probably be joining in, but today we'll be talking about the beginning of Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost is one of those iconic works of literature. You know, it's one of those things that is just one of the staples in English literature, just like, you know, sort of Shakespeare. And in a way, that's what this course does, is we're sampling all the major things that happened in literary history. So I didn't really want to leave Paradise Lost out. They're only having us read books 1 and 2, which is a fraction of the text. But I think even in book 1, you get a feel for what Milton was going for, what John Milton was going for in this piece. And so I wanted to spend some time today talking about book 1, but before I do, a few announcements and things to look after, housekeeping things. Number 1, I have finished any outstanding discussion 3 grades that needed to be done. So if you submitted that over the weekend, then I've gone back in there and those grades have already been included both in the STC and in the East grade book. So you can go back and check that. If you had an incomplete, I'll be clearing those today. I have to fill out a form for each incomplete. So I'll go through and do those when I finish with my classes today, and then that should post to your account in the next couple days, I would think, so that incomplete can be cleared up. Discussion 4 is due this week. Let me navigate to that. We talked about it a little bit last time, but that one is about Othello and humanism. The post is due Friday, so tomorrow. We do not have class tomorrow, but if you have any questions about discussion number 4, you can certainly email me. It's about how we see humanism in Othello, and then whether or not we think that Shakespeare included psychological complexities in Othello. It's kind of like 2 separate questions there. You could probably find ways to connect them if you wanted to, but it's not necessary. So do take a chance to look back at the comments that you have for the other 3 discussions, because all the time I'm trying to coach you into, you know, the top end 100 on your response. There are people who have made 300s on the discussions, and they're sitting in this Zoom right now. They know who they are, but there are people who are really racking up the hundreds because they're just so thorough, and their ideas are, you know, not just rehashed things from class. They're really reading and thinking about the material that they're reading. So my comments are always meant to build you and help you improve, and therefore improve your grade in the course and your attention to detail in your reading. So that's discussion 4. If anything comes up and you have questions, let me know, but that one is due tomorrow, just FYI. Also, if you go to Google Classroom, there is, I mentioned last time and went through a little bit of detail about the community scholarships that are available through WISD for seniors. So seniors, you need to watch the video that I talked about last time. Also, I've linked it again here because they want you to do this really simple Google form to indicate that you are aware that there are community scholarships and that the video instructions, you've watched them, it's like 4 minutes, so that you know what to do when you're applying. Sometimes what happens is we have scholarship night where all the scholarship recipients are revealed, and the parents are like, my kid didn't get any scholarships. And the counselors are like, well, everybody knew about it. Maybe your kid didn't do any applications. And so they like to document that everybody was told and is aware of those. So I do get a list of the people who have filled out that form. So I'm gonna have to start bugging people who don't. I don't really want to do that. But so just if you're a senior and you've already watched the video, go and just fill out that exit slip. If you haven't watched it, take 4 minutes out of your day today, watch the video that walks you through how to do it. It already opened on Tuesday, so you can work on the scholarship at any point. It's due on the 26th at noon, and then go and just fill out the form. It's just basically your name, who your English teacher is, and that. It's just simple. But please go ahead and do that also so that you are up to date with all of that information. I don't see anything in the chat on either one of those topics. So I feel like we can go ahead and start with Paradise Lost Book 1. Oh, you know what I wanted to point out? You probably already got this notification if your notifications are on for Google Classroom. But there's a great recording of Paradise Lost. It gets a little bit annoying because they have this really dramatic music that they keep putting in there over and over again. I don't know if you listen to it or not, but you can pretty much follow along in your text and listen to it. And it's got like different voices for the different characters. It's got sort of some background elements, and it's maybe a little more enjoyable to experience Paradise Lost by reading with that audio. You can also speed it up so that you're, you know, reading with focus. I don't know, I usually like to go at 1.25. 1.5 is a little fast for me to process in my brain, so I usually go 1.25. And not only that, but it helps me focus on my reading. My mind doesn't wander. But there's this really good one it's on YouTube, and I put the timestamps here so you can easily find book 2 when it's time to read that one for Tuesday. I also put that in Blackboard in the unit under other materials. So it's also here in case, you know, your Google Classroom is acting up or something. But it's in both places. Also, I watched this really good video. I'm not going to assign it to you because I feel like we're reading a lot. And with the discussions and the paper that's in process, I don't want to add an extra assignment. But I watched this really good video called Milton's Heaven and Hell. And it's got this guy the scholar who sort of follows the path of Milton through his life. And he goes to a lot of the locations where Milton lived and worked. And it kind of does his lifespan, but also it talks about how he developed the ideas for Paradise Lost, how, you know, his creative process for it, what we know about critics of Paradise Lost. It's like an hour video, but like I watched it on 1.25 or 1.5, and it wasn't too bad. It's really interesting. It's funny in some places. I don't often see a lot of videos that have those qualities. It was entertaining but informative. So I recommend that video, but I'm not going to assign it. I just think it'd be really cool background to know about the text. You can read the textbook stuff too, but it's kind of dry. And most of the time when you look on YouTube for stuff like that, it's, you know, professor lectures, and we aren't always the most entertaining, as I know. Anyway, so going to the calendar today, we're going to talk about book 1. You might want to open your study guide. I will go through that a little bit with you. There are some details and things that I want to talk about in the study guide, and there's also a PowerPoint that I want to go through as well. So, I mean, I pulled a few quotes and a few things to note as we're starting our study of Paradise Lost. I really wish we were reading the whole thing. I wish that I could teach a class on maybe like the first 3 units separate from the other 3 units. Like I wish first semester was unit 1, 2, and 3, and then second semester was like unit 4, 5, 6, because then we could have time to read more of these texts. But I did pull out some quotes and some other elements that I wanted you to take notes on today that will help you with your understanding of the text. So I have a PowerPoint here. I'll put this PowerPoint, I didn't link it yet, but I'll put it in the other materials on your Blackboard later today. So just a few concepts that it's important to keep track of, and we can see the roots of them even in books 1 and 2. Books 1 and 2 are just kind of the exposition of the work. So there's a whole arc that happens, you know, the whole the whole Freytag's pyramid. We're not even really getting into it, but we can start to see the roots of it because we can see the conflicts that are arising. We're in media res, so we can see that there's some things that have already occurred, like the big revolt and expulsion of Satan and a third of the angels. And so there are some roots in these concepts that we can see. They do continue through the rest of the text, just FYI, but we do see them. So hierarchy and order, we can see immediately the element of that in a couple of different ways in book one. Number one, we see that there's immediately a hierarchy in what will become hell, right? The angels wake up, they're in this sort of unformed place with a lake of fire. Eventually they build that into a place called pandemonium, which is an actual location in hell. We use that term sometimes. I don't know if you've heard that word before, but we use that term sometimes to show like chaos, right? Oh, the living room was in pandemonium with all my cousins over for the holidays or whatever. Really, that's referring to hell. So be careful about using that one. So we see immediately that there's a hierarchy. Satan, aka Lucifer, is immediately the one that everybody's looking at because he's the one who led the revolt. So Beelzebub is his right-hand man, and they sort of start discussing like what next steps, what should we do now that we sort of lost this battle against God. So there's immediately that hierarchy. We also see hierarchy versus order in the sense that when they challenged God, they realized that he had a hierarchy and that he's at the top of it because they suffered because of that revolt. So there's a hierarchy in heaven, and there's also a hierarchy in hell, and that is something that is good to note. Maybe that goes back to the great chain of being that we were talking about on Tuesday with the introductory lecture. Disobedience and revolt is another concept that is present, not just in this part, because we can see the results of disobedience. God has rejected these revolutionaries and has given them no access to heaven whatsoever, and instead banished them to this shapeless chaos that they find themselves because of their revolt. But as they debate and discuss what they should do next, all of these demons, they're demons now because they have been expelled from heaven and they're definitely not angels anymore. They discuss what's happening next. They have to decide, do we just accept this and this is our life now, or do we continue to do something to revolt against God? And the decision is going to be that they're going to continue to do things to pester God and to revolt against him. And the main one is that they need to corrupt his creation, his human creation. And so the majority of the rest of Paradise Lost is about how Satan infiltrates Eden and corrupts Adam and Eve and the fall of man, which is another disobedience, right? So then that leads to another disobedience with, we're not going to read it in books 1 and 2, it comes up in later chapters, but it's about how Adam and Eve disobey God. God says, do not eat from this tree. You don't need to have too much knowledge. You're innocent. You're living in this, beautiful sort of garden. You don't have to be knowledgeable about it. Don't eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And of course, that is exactly what Satan goes to do, because he and the demons have decided that's how they're going to continue to be a problem for God. They're going to keep corrupting his creations and keep making things worse. And they can't get back into heaven, but they can make God's job super tough. And there's a quote that I'll share with you in a minute that's about that. The idea of free will and predestination is brought up in both places as well. We see it in book 1 because obviously Satan and the other rebels or Lucifer at the time, had the idea that they were going to rebel. They didn't like God's sort of totalitarian regime and how he gave all of the good jobs to the son. And they had the free will as angels to rebel against him, just as God gave free will to Adam and Eve in the garden and they disobeyed him. So it's about that idea that God already knew those things were going to happen, but he gave humans the choice, the free will. And sin and innocence, I think that's pretty obvious. There's going to be a character called Sin. I don't know if it comes out at the end of book 2 or the beginning of book 3, but there's a character called Sin. There's another character called Death, and they kind of occupy the space between heaven and hell, and they monitor the gates that are between those two locations. Because when we're in book 1 and 2, it's sort of like right before God is going to create the earth and humans and all of that. So everything that's not in heaven is just kind of this unformed area of smoke and fire and clouds and stuff like that. And so it's described in the text. So sin is a character, but also an action, and we see that with Adam and Eve. So I think if you're looking for these things as you think about book 1 and as you think about book 2, I think that that's a really good anchor spot for just the basic concepts that Milton's going for in that text. All right, so a couple of quotes that I think are significant from book 1. I think there's 3 of them that I want to talk about and pull out a little bit. So the opening of book 1, after you get past the justification for the piece, right? Like first Milton talks about how he's going to talk about man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree. So he's kind of giving us the focus of his work. And then we have the invocation of the muse. Remember I told you on Tuesday that he was going to say, "Sing, heavenly muse, what in me is dark, illumine. Help me to be clear and help bring a light to my work." He is trying, he says, and this is a really key line, I want to justify the ways of God to men. I want man to understand God's purposes. So even though we see mainly demons in book 1 and 2, the book as a whole is intended to focus on how we can be better humans in God's eyes. And he explains our faults by talking about how Satan is able to sway us and corrupt human beings, beginning with Adam and Eve, and how we should probably watch out for that. But I don't know if you agree, but many scholars say in book 1, Satan is a compelling character. He's charismatic, he's got good points. He is basically arguing for democracy, and it's kind of hard to disagree with him in some ways, but it kind of depends on your religious upbringing. But we kind of start to go, Satan has a point there as we read through book 1. But in this point, it's the view of Milton. And so some people argue that Milton made Satan a way more interesting character. I don't think we're going to get to book 3 where God comes out, but God is kind of difficult to understand. He's got like a way of speaking that's kind of straightforward, but also like, I'm not going to reveal everything to you because I'm God kind of stance. And so Satan is a much more interesting character as we read through. Many scholars say that. But Milton expresses his goals here in that introductory part. As we get into the text, one of the things that we start noticing is that Satan is definitely the leader. And as they are sort of breaking their chains, there's a lake of fire and they're trying to figure out their surroundings and that sort of thing. And Satan says, "Fallen cherub, to be weak is miserable." I think he's talking to Beelzebub here. "To be weak is miserable, doing or suffering. But of this be sure, to do aught good never will be our task, but ever to do ill our sole delight." Meaning, we're not angels anymore, so now our goal is to do bad things, right? To do ill is our sole delight. So not only will we do bad things, ill, but we will also delight in it. the more evil we can conjure and create, the better. So we have to make this shift from being angels and trying to do good. Now our mission is to do ill. And that's what every Christian Bible really suggests about Satan is, the devil is there to tempt you into doing bad things. And so Milton plays on that. And this is the moment where Satan tells all of these fallen angels, we have a new mission statement. we have a new goal, and it's to create evil in the world. And being contrary to his high will, whom we resist. His high will is God, of course. So everything God wants, we're going to undermine it. Everything God creates, we're going to try to corrupt it. Everything God wants to be in existence, we're going to try to take it out of existence. If then his providence out of our evil seek to bring forth good, our labor must be to pervert that end, and out of good still to find means of evil. So even the good stuff, we're going to try to make it bad. And that's really one of the basic concepts of Christianity in general is that the devil is there to tempt and create corruption. And now we know why. He's mad, right? Like he's not satisfied with the results of the revolution, and so he's going to continue the revolution forever because these are immortal creatures. So then the third quote that I pulled from book 1 that I think is significant is when Satan says, he kind of puts it in a nutshell, and he says, the mind is its own place, which is a really interesting thing to think about. And maybe as you go through life, you start to notice that, right? Your mind can create an environment. Your mind can create a situation. And you could tell yourself, this is only temporary, whatever you're going through. Or you can tell yourself, I'm the best and I'm the greatest. And you can kind of create your own reality. And, Satan says that's true. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. So even if I'm in heaven, I could still create in my mind the belief that I'm in hell, or vice versa. We have the mental power and the free will to put ourselves mentally where we choose. Here we may reign secure. Nobody's going to bother us here. And in my choice, to reign is worth ambition, though in hell. I gladly accept the role of the leader in hell because he says it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, which is also a super famous phrase. And people have used it in revolutions since then. I mean, I think even in the Mexican Revolution, there's statements like that, right? So there are a lot of historical people that kind of pull on that idea and say, I'd rather be free, or I'd rather be in charge here than be a servant there. And so I might be poor, I might have disadvantages, I might have sacrifices I have to make, but I'm my own person. I get to make my own decisions here rather than be somebody else's servant somewhere else. That's all the quotes that I had pulled. I want to switch over to the study guide for a few minutes and see, there's a few notes that I want to mention in the sections here. So if you have your study guide or a copy of it, maybe you put a copy of it into your Google Drive. I do want to talk about some of the sections in book 1. And also, if you have questions, you can go ahead and raise them as I go through the sections a little bit. Does that make sense? Let me give you a minute in case you want to download that. It's on the calendar right here. Paradise Lost is a little bit complicated. There's a lot of speeches and things like that happen. So I just felt like a study guide with a summary on it would be a little more helpful for you. Also, I highlighted the names of the characters so that it's easy for you to refer to them. So we need to talk about Paradise Lost not just as a piece of literature, but as also a piece of criticism, because Milton is using Paradise Lost to talk about freedom and to talk about enslavement and to talk about good and to talk about evil. And he is in some ways creating an allegory that relates that to England and Britain at the time. So it's important to kind of talk about how he's using this really staple in religion to the advantage of making points about his society. So I want to talk about that a little bit. This first box just talks about the introductory material that says about the quote I just showed you, man's first disobedience. So it's he says he's going to talk about Adam and Eve and their struggle. And so there's a relation there to humanity. So I think over here I would note, I'm just going to put in some notes, that it's about Adam and Eve, but it's also about the human struggle. And it's about the tragedy of humans, that we have to exist in a world that has these temptations. If Satan, according to Milton, basically, if Satan hadn't revolted and taken a third of God's angels with him, then probably we wouldn't have the issue in the Garden of Eden. We wouldn't have, the battle with sin that humans experience even still. In the next section, I want to make a clarification about the use of the term Holy Spirit right here. So he is talking about the muse, which in ancient, I'm trying to highlight it, but this box is annoying, which in ancient literature, oh, I didn't mean to do it that way. I just wanted to highlight it. Oh, there we go. With it, which in ancient literature is a goddess, right? In a polytheistic, Greek mythology kind of way. The muses were actual goddesses. But because Milton is writing not mythology, he's writing, about Christian doctrine, he uses the Holy Spirit in the form of a muse. So as Ovid or Homer or any of those ancient, writers were writing and invoking the mythological muse, his muse is the Holy Spirit, because he's going to be writing about the Christian tradition. So he's talking about how the voice of God is coming through him. And so there's this idea that the Holy Spirit is going to be a force within him that he can present. So it's kind of like the voice of God. He's invoking the voice of God to help him tell this tale. The next box, stop me if there's something else in any of these boxes that you want me to spend more time talking about. The next one is about the acts of disobedience. So here's an example of how we see that recurring concept of disobedience present, because it talks about Adam and Eve's disobedience, but also Satan's attempted disobedience. Well, it's disobedience, it just isn't successful. So it's about how the creature is fighting the creator in both cases. In both cases, Adam and Eve go against God, and Satan also goes against God. So those two acts are related in some ways. There's some detail there that I pulled out from the text, how long it took the angels to fall from heaven and turn into these demons, and also how they are stunned there in their new environment for a few days. That's more plot related. Okay, here's where we can see in media res. Talks about how Satan is dazed. The whole rebellion has already occurred, and this is the consequence. This is the end result of that rebellion. So we know that we're starting, with some events already behind us. And so the focus for Milton isn't about the rebellion because that's already been decided. It's about what these fallen angels decide to do about the rebellion. So we focus first on Satan, and is he an antagonist? Well, he was. I'm gonna put Satan right here. So the question is, if Satan is the main feature at the beginning, God doesn't even come out until later. He's referenced, but he isn't a character that's speaking or anything until I think book 3. Is Satan our antagonist, or is he the protagonist of the text? That's something to contemplate, because immediately Milton focuses on the fallen angels and Satan as their leader. So it's kind of questionable whether, who he intended to be the antagonist. You can have, for example, a negative protagonist. You can have a protagonist that is not a positive character, right? So who are we following in this text? Are we following God or in his actions, or are we following the actions of these fallen angels? And if you're just looking at books 1 and 2, the answer seems to be that we're following these fallen angels. I don't see anything in the text, so I'm just going to continue. It's interesting, I think, in the text that Satan never really calls God by name. He just refers to him as a he. And so, we don't get Satan saying the word God, really. He just sort of talks about the tyranny of heaven. He sees God as a tyrant. So I'm going to put that down here. Oops. And I guess from a certain perspective, if I take myself out of whatever religious training that I've had, I could kind of say, I guess if God's up there in heaven and he says, this is how it's going to be, I'm the one in charge, nobody can challenge me, I'm going to make all the decisions, I already know everything. There could be a certain person or angel in this case that says, wait a minute, what about what I think or what others think? Or are we just here as your servants or what? So I could see how they would consider him a tyrant if they have to do his bidding and his work all the time. And he says, since heaven can't be killed and neither can we, they're just our eternal tyrant unless we rebel. So it's a revolt. I can put the note here. He starts talking about the rebellion. And so we can put here that it's about the revolt against that hierarchy that I noted at the beginning of the lecture today. And we see that great chain of being. I'm going to put that in here too, because that does show, I know that comes out on the midterm. So if you have to relate great chain of being to a text, I would relate it to Paradise Lost. And then you should be prepared to talk about how that occurs. We see that because remember the image from that lecture, God is holding the end of the chain and it goes through all of creation. God created the angels, God created, humans and trees and animals and all those things. So there's definitely a hierarchy, and Satan challenges it. There's a long description of the location where they are, but also a description of Satan's body, which is, kind of floating there on the edge of the sea as we open on the text. And so I think that we could note that there's, like in a literature way, there's rich language. he sort of pulls himself out of this liquid fire and comes up onto the shore, and Beelzebub comes with him, and so that's when they start their conversation. There's a lot of description of the lake and the place where they are, which is what I am depicting here. The famous painting of that sort of unframed space. It's like a, glob of fire and mountains and craggy hills and that sort of stuff. But they end up taking shape into pandemonium. I don't remember if that's in book 1 or not. But it's a piece of literature, so there is that rich language. There's a lot of exaggeration about the description of the characters and so on and so forth. At first, Satan doesn't understand his situation. And so he starts talking to Beelzebub about it, and they talk about how they aren't sure if they should continue their rebellion or not. Later on, Satan will find out that God has punished him not just by exiling him from heaven and putting him in this space that eventually becomes hell, but also that the pain that he encounters and all the demons encounter in hell is eternal, that they're constantly in pain no matter where they go. So he doesn't understand that immediately. And he thinks that the pain is related to his location. But later, Satan leaves hell. He has to go and corrupt human beings, and especially Adam and Eve. He has to go to the Garden of Eden. Excuse me. So he realizes later that he's still going to be controlled by God in some way. I want to make a note here on this part of the summary where Satan starts to, stand up and put on his armor. He starts to say, okay, well, that didn't go well. Make sure that his legions wake up. He's trying to call them forth. There's some epic similes in there that describe the setting, and an epic simile is just an extended simile. Describing how they are coming out of the lake. He decides to change his name, and that is, pretty dramatic as well. Note that all of these fallen angels obey him, and he says that they all need new names. That's like symbolic, right? We think about changing our names when there's some sort of symbolic change in our lives. It's traditional for women to take the last name of their husband upon marriage. Sometimes people change their names for various reasons. But in this case, they can't keep the same names that they had when they are in heaven, because now their whole goal is the opposite. So they talk about that. Moloch and Belial are described. These are more, they're not Satan's like right hand demons, but they're part of the decision making, and they start forming a little bit of a debate. They start talking about what they should do next, and there are some of these demons start taking on the forms of ancient mythological creatures and things like that. There's some lists of all of the different names that they're going to be taking. Satan is in his armor, and he stands up, and he's very powerful, and they can all see that he's commanding them, and so they all, go to him. And there's some imagery of that. I want to notice that down here. So they're brought to him, they're drawn to him as their leader. He led them through the revolt, and now they're obviously, going to keep following him. And they're all still dressed in their war clothes and, whatever, pieces and parts are still left of their armor. And so they start to rise and form an audience around Satan. And there are all these epic similes and imagery in this section that that describe how the legions are before him. And so I'm just going to put epic simile again. So Satan feels empowered by this, and it gives him the ability to speak to all these other fallen angels or demons and give them hope. He doesn't use the name God. I'm going to make a note there again. Interestingly enough, he just talks about, the heavens and how they have been unjustly, ceremoniously dumped out of heaven. And he says, maybe we should continue to rebel. Maybe we should continue to fight, and like, rather than just accepting our fate. So they all kind of agree. They have these swords that are flaming, and they all sort of rally around Satan and accept him as their leader, basically continuing. And also they are pledging their lives to him in a way. There's this, they reaffirm their defiance against heaven right here. So then they all fly up to this one area of this chaos, and they start pulling out the earth and digging. There are a couple of other creatures that urge them on, and basically they end up finding gold and minerals and things like that that help them to build what's called pandemonium. I'm going to note that down here. It's a temple. There's a lot of hyperbole in the description of that. It's greater than the pyramids of Egypt or anything humans have ever built. And there's this one demon that's there. I think his name is Mulciber. And he's the one who calls it pandemonium. And so they create this in terms of a hall where they can all meet, but also sort of like the main capital of hell. And they all enter, and there's golden seats. And at the end of book one, they all sit down, because book two is going to be the debate about what they should do now, right? The great debate is going to be, do we fight back against God, or do we just accept our destiny? There are some scholars who say that pandemonium is a parody of the ornate churches that were being built at the time. The idea that, the devils create this golden location for them to worship and follow Satan kind of mirrors the fact that at the time in the 17th century, a lot of really ornate churches are created, lots of money spent on that, the artwork, and the work that it takes to create the outside of these cathedrals. Meanwhile, people are starving in the streets. So how do you spend all that money creating this artificial location in which to worship while human beings are suffering and Milton is kind of mimicking that and making a parody of that ornate church. Why do devils need an ornate location in order to sit and listen to debates about how they should tempt and corrupt human beings? So there's a little bit of a satire there in his work, and that's one of the features of 17th century writing is the idea of satire. We are left on a cliffhanger, right? The cliffhanger at the end is that all of the demons come in and they sit down and they're going to get ready to hear Satan talk about their future plans, if they should have future plans, and they're going to have this big debate about what they should do with the leadership of hell. There's more stuff that you could fit in here, but these are just the main ones that I felt were important to bring up to you today. Is there anything on the study guide that you want me to go into more detail about? I didn't see anything as I was going through it. I'm looking there in the chat. Again, there are quotations that are on the midterm, and if I'm pulling them out and talking about them in class, then they're probably significant ones to remember and be able to connect to the piece of literature and the significance of those quotes. I don't know that you'll get them on the midterm because it's random, but I do want to point out that if I've pulled out a quotation to talk about here, it's probably important enough also to remember from the midterm and be able to connect it to a piece of literature, because it won't be connected to a piece of literature, just be a quotation. And you'll have to say what piece of literature that is connected to and how it is connected to it. So you might get something from Wife of Bath's Tale, you might get something from Beowulf, you might get something from Othello, you might get something from Paradise Lost, or multiple ones, I don't know. But speaking of the midterm, I would like to know, you've had a week now pretty much to look at the study guide for the midterm, and we don't have class tomorrow, but I'm wondering if you have any questions about how that's going to work. We have one more class period before the midterm. Next week, we only have class on Tuesday. We do not have class on Thursday or Friday, even though it's a B week, because at the end of next week, you should be working on your midterm. But I just wanted to touch base and see if there's anybody who has questions about the study guide, how to use the study guide, what will be on the exam, anything like that. Hopefully you've had a chance to get started on your study plan. I'm gonna monitor the chat and see if there are any questions. I don't see anything. We do not have class tomorrow. We have class on Tuesday, and that will be the last day that we have class before you do the midterm. The midterm opens Wednesday morning and closes Saturday night. So you'll have that window in order to complete your midterm. You do need to finish it in one sitting. It's not timed, so you can have as much time as you would like, but you have to finish it in that one setting. If you close out of the exam and you're not finished, then you won't be able to get back in and complete whatever you have. So I did mention last week that if you have an intermittent Wi-Fi connection, if you're worried that there's other people in the house that are doing online things and you would rather be in a stable location where your internet can be consistent, then do send me a message. We can definitely find a place for you. You can come and sit in my classroom. We can find a different location for you where you can just, be on the school Wi-Fi. You will have to bring your Chromebook or whatever laptop you have. They don't have any here anymore, but I have a charging station is all I have for Chromebooks now. But yeah, so if you are worried about that, set it up with me before Wednesday so that I can make sure that you can sign in and, wear your mask and all that stuff if you decide that you want to come in. So there shouldn't be any issues with you dropping out of, your connection with your Wi-Fi. I don't see anything in the chat about the midterm or any of the material for today. So I'm going to go ahead and call this class period concluded. If anything comes up, please send me a message and let me know what's going on, and I will try to help you. Other than that, we have for Tuesday, wait, that's, yeah, here we go. For Tuesday, we have Paradise Lost Book 2. So you have discussion due tomorrow, the responses due Monday, and then Paradise Lost Book 2, which is about the same length as Book 1. They're about the same length. That will be for next Tuesday. And then after that, midterm and spring break. So I will dismiss you and I will see you again on Tuesday. Have a good weekend, everybody.